get us. Welcome, one and all. It's been a busy weekend of swimming, all told, between folk in meets down south, people in meets around the country, and the National Junior Team weekend that I've just returned from in Aberdeen. So welcome. Pleased to just change tack a little bit tonight. We've been doing an awful lot of focus on psychology with Jack and with Zoe. We've done some stuff on physical preparation for training for racing with JT and Stephen, if you recall, and we've also had some input on those of you who are looking to leave school over the next couple of years and what the implications and actions are for you in terms of considering what your best options are. Tonight, delighted in the first instance to welcome Nikos Jakubiak, who's our lead practitioner from the Sports Scotland Institute of Sport. He's a lead practitioner on nutrition as part of the Commonwealth Games team effort in 2018. Delighted to see his smiling face and his map of the world behind him, which frames all of his Zoom calls. And we're looking at what you put into your body by way of nutrition, nutrients, liquids, supplements, all of that today, and really talking about examining your responsibility, in fact, your ownership of everything that goes into your body, and how important that is, particularly for our sport, but also in the climate of sport as it exists these days. So I'm delighted to invite Nikos to kick us off, to get us going. And I'm expecting Carrie, who's our medical advisor, to join the call shortly as well. And I'll do a wee intro for her before she speaks. But for now, over to you, Nikos.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And indeed, we'll have a nice chat today about nutrition. I'm gonna try and share here my screen, and hopefully this should work. Let's see. If this has worked, you should be seeing my first slide.
We are. Yeah. All good, Nikos. All good, thankfully.
Fantastic. Okay. Now, again, probably quite a few participants today. Normally, I would like a bit of interaction and being able to maybe answer questions on the spot, but maybe for this one, if you want to type any questions and we can answer them at the end, or just unmute and ask at the end. And again, today there are some key messages that hopefully we'll be able to get through. And we want to make sure we understand some basic concepts such as nutritional value and nutritional periodization. We often see with a lot of athletes in aquatics that they don't necessarily always appreciate the importance of being able to eat enough for what their training is going to be like leading up to a training camp or some sort of key training block. And hopefully, again, we're laying some foundation there that is going to pay dividend later on. And by the end of this, hopefully you have an understanding of a basic nutritional periodization model, how it works, and again, how does this mean, what this actually means in terms of putting a meal together. Now, I'm just going to start with I guess a very simple question, like just being clear in our minds, fundamentally, why do we eat? What is it that gets us to eat food? And of course, on a very basic level, it's just a pure response to hunger. People eat because they get hungry. But of course, because of other reasons, humans don't eat just because when they're hungry. You often find that people will eat because they're bored or they maybe have a conditioned response. And I often use this example, like, I don't know about you guys, but I certainly find myself, if I go to the cinema, for example, like I seem to associate cinema with popcorn. Whether you see me eating popcorn anywhere else, in any other setting, I think it's unlikely. But for me, in a cinema, I won't sit down and eat popcorn. And it's a conditioned response to this particular activity. And of course, the more, I guess, familiar maybe to most of us, the response would be eating either because you're very happy or maybe because you're sad. There's this emotional response to eating. So just from the beginning here, to make it clear that we are very, very well aware that, athletes, although they're trying to be these wonderfully tuned machines, at the end of the day, they're not machines. So they're not going to just eat because they're hungry and because they need to eat something. There are other factors that we always have to keep in mind for the overall health, physical health, mental health of the athlete. And then the other thing, that's important for us to understand when we're working with athletes is certainly understanding what motivates the food choices. What is the main reason people decide to eat certain foods? Some people might be trying to eat because they just want to stay healthy. Others might be more or a lot image conscious. Others just enjoy the pleasure they get from eating different types of foods. And of course, there will be people who are primarily consume or interested in consuming foods that will help their performance. And ideally, this is the kind of like place we are, where yes, to some degree, maybe we are mindful of our image. Maybe we do want to get pleasure from our food. Of course, we want to be healthy, but we want people in aquatics, whether swimming, diving, any sort of aquatic sport, they understand that the influence nutrition choices, food choices make in their performance. And the other very important thing is with any sport, it doesn't matter what your sport is, what your event is. It's very important to understand that when it comes to competition, when it comes to training, the outcomes can be affected by many, many factors, quite a few of them which are completely outside your control, but there are plenty of things there which are within your control, turning up for training, giving in an honest effort, making sure you have the right equipment, making sure you have the right sort of performance lifestyle, making sure again you are looking after yourself on all fronts. And of course, the area that I'm particularly interested in is the nutrition choices. And again, that is something we have to be very clear with all our young athletes. And whether you are a parent listening to me just now, or you are an athlete yourself, this is a very important message that has to get through, that nutrition choices, hydration, these are things that will influence performance. And it's something that's under our control. We make a choice whether we eat well or we don't. And why on earth should we be so concerned about good food choices? Because there's so many different aspects that will be affected by our daily food choices. And of course, the obvious one will be things like fuel, and especially some events in swimming, and certainly I would say most events, from what I've seen over the years, how the boys and girls train. The demand for fuel is quite high. So of course, if you don't get enough nourishment, you're already going to have a struggle there. Being able to hold back sort of fatigue, resist fatigue over certain efforts, so certain key sessions, your ability to focus. And again, if you think of maybe more technically highly sort of events where as you go on, you might start suffering in your ability to maintain that concentration. Your recovery, how well can you recover between sessions? So you finish one session and then you're ready to hit again on the next one. And for people who train, 2-3 times a week, that's not a big deal. They'll be fine. But for most of the boys and girls we work with, men and women we work with in swimming, in diving, these people train multiple times every day. So recovery becomes a massive limiting factor if you don't get it right. And then, of course, training adaptations, if you're trying to get stronger muscles, if you're trying to get sort of the right adaptations in your physique, again, how you eat, those things will be massively important. Your weight, your growth. As the age group we are addressing with this talk, we're still dealing with athletes who are still growing. They haven't, fully developed, which means, again, if you're not getting the nourishment that your body needs, you're probably compromising the full extent of your growth. And perhaps less obvious things, being able to prevent illness, being able to prevent injury, your mood and motivation, all those things will have somewhat some, if you like, influence by your food choices. And if I was to distill all this information and all the information behind this, I can actually say that at the end of the day, what we're trying to be able to do very well is to achieve one important objective, and this is this readiness to perform. So what I care about as a nutritionist is, does the swimmer, the diver, are they able to do the training, maintain the high quality of that training throughout, and do it again and again, like if that's a training camp or if that's a multi-day event. Now, when we're talking about food, it's very important, again, overall, we are, there are sort of 4 pillars, there are 4 sort of areas that we are concentrating on. And food hygiene, again, it doesn't seem to be, if you like, an issue as such for most of us in this part of the world. But nevertheless, it can be something that for a young athlete, it's not, there are things that maybe for the older people in the audience maybe are obvious, but for the younger athletes, again, it's something that you need to be aware of. For example, simple hand hygiene, simple things of how making sure you are not allowing any contamination in your food that will end up some sort of sickness. And we have horror stories of people not getting it right and being ill during a competition or even in training. Food safety in terms of allergens, people who may have allergies, things like dodgy stuff that might be possible to fail you an anti-doping test. And again, these are things that perhaps are not in your mind just now, but as you progress in your career and you are climbing up, if you like, the rankings, it's very important you're becoming aware of all these risks here. And Carrie will, of course, touch upon this later on. And later in the year, we will also do more stuff with this through the Food First course, which is going into more detail about all of this. But for us, again, the other very, very important aspect here is this nutritional value, which is another very, very important factor when we're talking about food, as well as food enjoyment. And when we're talking about nutritional value, well, first of all, let me just very quickly present here the Eating Well guide that was revamped just only a few years back. And you'll see, again, I mean, most of you probably are familiar with this plate model that kind of like shows the different food groups. And in a very sort of basic level, these foods here, so your dairy products, your meat, beans, fish, eggs, these are the foods that are very, very important for your muscle development, so your muscle recovery. Then you're having all these starchy foods, your potatoes, rice, bread, pasta, all those things, massively important, especially for swimmers, because they're your carbohydrate foods. And carbohydrate is the fuel of choice when your body is going through high intensity training. It's not just about eating anything, you need carbohydrate. A low carbohydrate diet, for example, will mean for somebody who's trying to do lots of miles at high intensity, then they're not going to manage. And then, of course, you have all your high fiber foods, your vegetables, your fruit, which are very, very important to help all these other things work better. Think of them almost like catalysts, but also to keeping your overall health, the health of your gut, your immune system, lots of the other things. What's interesting about this particular Eat Well guide is that they used to have all the, I guess, sweeties and all these kind of like sugary snacks and stuff like that part of the plate, whereas now they kind of like put them aside. And yes, recognizing that they will be in your diet, but just be sensible with how much you're having. But the key message for us is that when you're dealing with an athlete, yes, you need all these different nutrients, but they usually need to come within a certain calorie budget. There's so many calories a swimmer or a diver might need, and within that number of calories, you have to achieve the fiber intake, the protein, the vitamins, the minerals, all the different antioxidants. There's all the different stuff that you have to be able to take, which takes us nice to this idea of nutritional density, nutritional value. So nutritional density, I like to sort of describe it almost like this population density. Just imagine this idea that if you have a vast area where there's nobody really lives, there's just maybe a couple of houses. In that area, there are only a few people. Equally, you can have the same surface of areas, the same area, and with that, lots of skyscrapers, lots of buildings, well, the population density in the city is going to be much higher because there's many more people for the same space, for the same amount of square meters. So there's a pretty much similar, if you like, principle here. Imagine you having something that will give you, when you eat that, you'll get about 500 calories. So for example, a small meal, something like a bit of chicken, a bit of vegetables, some couscous, and that will give you about 500 calories. And equally, you might eat a milk chocolate bar, which equally will give you about 500 calories. But the nutritional density of a chocolate bar is very, very low because you get plenty of calories, but very little in terms of vitamins, minerals, fiber. Whereas it's the other way around when it comes to your healthier options. And in a more kind of like a basic way, when we're thinking about a general diet, which is low in nutritional density, like low nutritional value, we kind of talking about all these highly processed foods, all these kind of like beige foods, all your pizzas and your fries and your your pretzels and all that kind of stuff. Whereas when you're talking about high nutritional value, you're talking about foods which are usually things like vegetables, fruit, and usually the diet tends to be very, very colorful, much more interesting. And if I'm not sort of selling the point yet, let me make another sort of very useful point here. Is I often see a lot of young athletes and older athletes. They tend to snack. And their snacks of choice tend to be sugary snacks. And again, I don't have anything particularly against those things. It's just making sure that the athletes, you as parents or as coaches, and if you are athletes on this talk, just being mindful that those things will come with what we call empty calories, that this idea of low nutritional density, low nutritional value. And sugar is an example of that, where yes, you get calories, but there's nothing else that comes with it. So here's a very simple chart, something that some people might consider sort of healthier option, something like a crunch, like a crunch bar, it will be the equivalent of 3 teaspoons of sugar. And you go a bit further up, something like a Snickers bar. I mean, every Snickers bar you'll have like a regular sort of size. It's about 40-80 grams. That's 6 teaspoons of sugar. A can of Coke is 8 teaspoons of sugar. I mean, these are massive amounts. And I've seen swimmers, consuming a whole bag of Haribos, and just to give you an idea, a bag of Haribos, which is just under 200 grams, size of 200 grams. That's over 23 teaspoons of sugar, plenty of sugar there. And the other thing about sugar to remember is that it obviously contributes to the overall calorie of the product. So for example, something like a can of Coke, a sugary can of Coke, all the calories come from sugar. There's nothing else. But for all the other products, again, you can see from half to almost 3/4 of the contribution of calories will be from sugar. Now, again, as I said, occasionally, as part of this idea that we're eating, sometimes we make choices only because we want the pleasure from the food. I can understand those things can be there. Just make sure they're not your go-to options. Now, some alternative options, I'm not necessarily saying this is an exhaustive list, by any means, but just some suggestions you might want to consider when you're talking about nice, healthier snacks that will hopefully do this kind of like a nice balance between still being very enjoyable, but still giving you some nourishment. So it might be things like Greek yogurt with some sort of fruit, or some smoothie, fresh fruit, milky drinks. Sometimes you might want to combine things like strawberries or bananas and melt some dark chocolate and dip that in. Breakfast cereals. You can make oat bars. You can make yogurt with honey and the various nuts. Maybe a savory snack like hummus and various things like carrot sticks and things like that. Nuts and seeds, fruit salad, various dried fruit, and even things like what we call like vegan cakes. And usually they are made instead of using flour, they're using black beans. And again, they're much higher in nutrient content, but still very enjoyable. I mean, I promise you, they're still fantastic in terms of taste. And very sort of nicely, let's move on now to this idea of nutrition periodization, and what do we mean by this? I guess you will all be familiar that when you're looking into your weekly training, it's highly unlikely that your training volume, training intensity, the demands that you have in your training is kind of like a flat line. Usually there's some sort of undulating sort of model going on in the background. There's probably some days where things are much harder, or they get a bit easier. Maybe it might be very easy. So you'll have anything from a rest day to a very tough day. And even if it is not within the week, it will certainly be from week to week. And that is an important thing for us to understand, because it means that the demands for nourishment will change based on what the demands are in training. So, for example, somebody who weighs 70 kilograms might find that their protein needs will be somewhere between the equivalent of 350 to 600 calories a day. In terms of fats, their need might be between 500, 700 calories a day, but the need for carbohydrate might fluctuate between 600 to well over 2,000 calories a day. And that is a very important piece of information, especially for swimmers, because what this means is understanding that the greatest variability in your nutritional needs will come from carbohydrate, that they're very necessary for fueling that high intensity effort. And of course, the other interesting thing about carbohydrate foods, especially foods that are highly processed, is that they're very easy to overconsume. So if you think of things like bread, pasta, rice, cereals, cake, sugary snacks, I mean, all those things are pretty much carbohydrate-based foods. So how can we make this work in real life? The whole idea of planning, preparing meals, preparing snacks, and preparing fluids. A very simple model I want you to kind of like understand is, when you're trying to plan anything, first of all, you need to be clear in your mind what actually is happening through the day. So if you think of a timeline where, take a piece of paper, just draw a line, and think of the time you wake up to the time you're going to bed at night again. Now, no matter how busy you are or not, you'll make sure that in that timeline, you are making sort of room for 3 main meals: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and perhaps a snack, which can go anywhere. I mean, in this model, it's kind of like close to dinner time, but it doesn't matter where this goes, it's up to you. But then the idea is that if you're having a training session, then in your kit bag, there should be some sort of snack that might go before or after the session. And if you're having a double session, and that's often the case we'll see with older swimmers, where they'll finish one session and then there's a back-to-back second one in the same morning. That will, of course, mean more snacks should be available. And if you're having an evening session, again, more snacks should be available. And if this is one of those tough training weeks, well, you might even want to consider having another snack before going to bed. So you can see that this is a very organic way to periodize your nutrition without having to think hard about it, because if you're having fewer training sessions, by definition, you'll have fewer snacks in the mix. So what this means is that you can keep your portion sizes as far as your main meals are concerned, and nice and regular. You don't have to make adjustments for that. And you also have to think of using the snacks, the carbohydrate snacks, to match the nutritional requirements for the day. And of course, as you are getting better at this, then you can sort of take into account your training frequency, the intensity, the objectives for that block, and where you are in the season. It can get quite sophisticated, quite complicated, and of course that's not where we want to be at this point, for sure. Now, again, it doesn't matter how you make it look, but you might have a simple grid, a simple sort of table where, again, maybe think a day of the week where you have a bit of headspace. You can think Just maybe make a very rudimental note keeping of how many snacks you might need, how many meals you might need. You don't need to go into any details, but just to make sure you're prepared. Because we find that if people are not prepared and they're going through a very busy day, you might have school, you might have college, you might have other things going on, and training on top of that, traveling between venues. All of a sudden, the day becomes packed, and you find that you don't have the time to think clearly what I want, what I should have, and prepare. And it's just a natural human tendency under these situations to go for easier options. And especially when you're finding you're needing food and you're hungry, you might find that you're more inclined to make poor food choices. So planning is especially important for our athletes. So final thing then, in terms of the plate, what does the plate look like when we talk about main meals? Very, very basic blueprint for your main meals is that you're looking for something that will give you protein, something that will give you carbohydrate, and something that will give you sort of your sort of fiber foods, all the vitamins, the minerals. And again, you don't need to sort of complicate things. It's always a case of thinking, okay, for example, you might be having sort of spaghetti and beef mince, so there you go. So there's already, my mince is going to be my protein source, my spaghetti is going to be my carbohydrate source. Now, in that mix, I might have tomatoes, I might have onions. So there is something as a vegetable. However, in this example, I would also be even more happy if I see a nice salad on the side, something nice green, or something with tomato, something like that. If you're having a more sort of traditional kind of like Scottish idea, like a roast meal. So again, you might be having chicken, you might be having lamb or beef with some potatoes, and again, plenty of parsnips, carrots, and various greens. Fantastic. These are the kind of like things we want to be seeing in terms of main meals. And again, with snacks, think about when you're trying to organize your snacks, you want something that's going to be easy, of course, to carry in a kit bag, or easy to access anyway, either before or after your session. Something that's going to be certainly carbohydrate based, easy to digest, something that you're familiar with and doesn't upset your tummy, and you're happy to consume. Now, there can be thousands of examples, and what I encourage every athlete I work with is that they come up with their own top 10 list of training snacks or even competition day snacks, and these are that way they have a variety of things that they know work for them, and they're happy with, they have tried and tested, and it's a good list. So again, this is something very important. And if you're having a snack just after training, again, having carbohydrate is still important because you're trying to replenish some of the carbohydrate you've used up during the session. But it's also probably a good time to also give the system a little bit more protein. So this might be a good time to have something which has more milk, for example, or something that might have sort of scrambled eggs or some sort of egg. And egg is a wonderful protein source because it's very, very easy to digest, and so it's a wonderful thing to have. But of course, milk or milky drinks will still be up there. And again, if you think of things like yogurt, cottage cheese, quark, there's lots and lots of nice things that you can start sort of experimenting with, trying. And as I said, come up with your own sort of list of nourishing snacks that you enjoy, they agree with you, and they're easy to have in your kit bag. And just a final point, never forgetting that in all of this, we need to make sure we're staying well hydrated. A very simple rule of thumb. I'm not going to give you a number of how many glasses you need to drink a day, because that is such an impossible task. How much fluid you need to take depends on many factors. Ultimately, you'll know if you're drinking enough simply by, if you like, the color of your urine. As a rule of thumb, if your urine is dark across the day, then you can be pretty confident you need to drink a bit more. And if you tend to drink, if you tend to go to the toilet quite a few times in the day to empty your bladder, and every time, you get kind of like clear, almost like a water-looking urine, that's probably an indication that, yeah, you are maybe getting more fluid than is actually necessary. But again, as a rule of thumb, if you are training, sometimes it might be, especially if you go into a warmer climate to train, it might be a good habit to check your weight before and after the session to make sure you are putting back the fluid. And again, a very simple, this is not exact science, but a very simple practice would be check your weight and the difference. So if you are lighter by kilogram, that means you need to put back in your system about 1.5 liters of fluid. And again, you don't need to sit down and gallop down 1.5 liters of fluid, just in case it gives you a target for what you need to do in the following, couple of hours. So hopefully I haven't sort of taken too much of the time, Alan, but this is kind of like the messages I wanted to put across so far.
Thank you, Nikos.
Any questions?
We'll just pause, nothing in the chat. I'll just pause at that point to see if anyone does have any questions in there. Thank you so much. It's really comprehensive in terms of probably covering so many things that people might have wanted to ask about as you went to the next thing and to the next thing and to the next slide. I'm sure there were people, what about that? And then you covered it. So I'll just give folk a chance to write some things in the chat if they want, and then we can hand over to Carrie. So here's something about vegetarian and vegan swimmers. Any particular advice for them, Nikos?
Well, yeah, I guess any sort of type of diet you choose to follow, the first thing you have to make sure it is very clear in your mind is how is that approach going to be limiting? If like what am I potentially missing out by following this way of eating, whatever it is you choose to do. And when you think about vegetarian diets in general, I mean, there's not really anything that you would say, oh, this person is going to miss out on this nutrient or that nutrient. Not really. That's not really something you can say realistically. But when you talk about vegan diet, then potentially there, you can argue that if you don't get it right, you could potentially be running very low in things like B12, things like iron. Now, B12 in particular is something that it is not available in plant sources, if you like, in plant foods. So that would be something if you are a vegan, if you decide to become a vegan, that's probably the one vitamin you will have to maybe talk to your GP or talk to your nutritionist, dietitian, and see what you should be doing, because generally speaking, you cannot get it naturally from this type of diet. But as a vegetarian, you won't have this issue because you are likely still getting some food products that are animal origin that will have the B12. However, there is still a risk with both groups that they're not getting iron, because we are conditioned in this part of the world, we are conditioned to eat a lot of meat. And so for most of us, iron isn't an issue because we tend to eat a lot of either meat or meat products, which will be a good source of iron. So if all of a sudden you decide to become a vegetarian and you remove all that meat you were properly eating, you then have to be conscious of that gap in the iron contribution. Where is that iron going to come from now? And I'm telling you this from personal experience, because when I was a young lad, I decided to become a vegetarian, but I didn't pay attention to that gap, and I ended up with anemia. And so I know this from first hand. It's a very easy mistake to make. So yeah, as long as you're having plenty of dark vegetables, like dried fruits, nuts, seeds, things like that, beans. I mean, yes, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to get the iron. But again, it's that message of nutritional value. Whatever type of diet you decide to go for, as long as it gives you good nutritional value and it's helping you stay healthy and match your demands for that training quality, well, we're happy.
Thank you. I think that's that in the chat. So I shall try and find Carrie on a different view.
Oh, I think there's one more question. Should we answer this question quickly, Alan? It's okay.
Of course, can, yeah.
The question I can read here is how to know if you're actually eating enough. Well, yeah, that's a wonderful question, because and that probably sustains the whole industry. But listen, with nutrition, what everybody needs to understand, diet and nutrition is not an exact science. So people will often talk about, count calories and do all sorts of things, or complicate things and make it look very sophisticated, or what have you. And it's not an exact science. And for me, on a basic, very, very basic level, how do I know I'm eating enough? Well, as an athlete, here are some things I'm looking for. I'm looking for, when I turn up for training, do I turn up and I feel motivated? Because if I'm dragging myself to go to training, there's a good chance that I'm not eating enough. Now, of course, it could be, lack of sleep. It could be maybe overtraining. Of course, there are other factors. But certainly that would be one thing that I will have to look into is, am I eating enough? When I'm finishing, or when I'm about to finish the training session, am I finishing strong? So basically, in other words, do I own the session, or do I just, kind of like survive it? Again, that could be, for me, another indication that I'm eating enough. And then the other thing is, if I am monitoring my weight, certainly for young swimmers, from week to week, what I don't expect to see is a weight drop. I expect young swimmers, as they're getting older, to also be getting heavier. So if my young swimmer is getting lighter, for me, that's an indication that they're not eating enough. Once we have an adult swimmer, it's a different situation there. That's probably for another time to answer this. But these are the three simple things. How you feel. How motivated do you feel? How strong you finish in your training session, and is your weight dropping? Those three things, very simple things to check, and in my experience, much more reliable than any silly calorie counting or anything like that. If anybody suggests you that in the future, so yeah, hopefully that answers it.
And one more, Nikos, which is a good question around changing portion sizes of the main meals to avoid snacking because of the cost. And brackets, the important clue is uni shouldn't ask in the question.
Yeah. Now, let me just sort of clarify this thing. This is a model I came up as an advice, like a suggestion years ago, because I found it that a lot of people struggle to understand how to vary their portion size for main meals to match the requirements. So to apply nutritional periodization became quite complicated. So I came up with this model of suggesting, okay, how about we fix the meal sizes? You never have to worry about changing portion sizes. And all you're doing is you're playing with the number of snacks between the day. And then you add in if you're doing more stuff, and you take away if you're doing less stuff. And over the years, I found that has been a much more easier model to follow. But it doesn't mean it has to be the only way to do it. Of course, if you are happy to manipulate the portion sizes, there's no reason why it cannot be done. One other reason I'm not a fan of playing about with the portion sizes. I think it's emotionally difficult, especially with swimmers. Imagine, you're going through this big training block and you have to eat, big bowls of lots of food, and you're getting conditioned to that. And then as you're getting into your tapering and you have to start cutting back a little bit, then you probably emotionally, you might feel that you're not eating enough because you have to see your main meals kind of like shrinking down. And again, that's not necessarily something that everybody will think or feel, but that's another argument for me. So yes, if you're happy to manipulate portion sizes and expand, shrink as appropriate to match your training week, absolutely go for it. But I would say in terms of finances, there's no reason why you could still not do it with snacks, because what you could do, for example, if you're on a low budget, you still have your portion size standard, and maybe look for lower budget snacks. So, for example, I can have bananas, I can have small scones, I can have maybe cheaper cereal bars. So things are cheaper and easier to have in my kit bag and still follow this model. But again, it doesn't have to be this way. One or the other way, it's fine. Whatever works for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nikos. Carrie's been trying to wriggle off the hook by saying that you're answering all the questions that she was going to cover, but we're not buying that at all. But it was a really nice try. Welcome, Carrie. It must be one of the busiest people I know. So thank you very much for squeezing us into your busy schedule of putting children to bed and all the rest of the things that you do that are just as important. Carrie's our medical advisor. As I said at the start, she's also Institute doc and is involved happily with the Commonwealth Games team again next year at Birmingham. So Carrie's super interactive with her presentations. She's just proved that point by getting Mentimeter up on the screen. So I'm going to hand over to Carrie, not steal her thunder, and seamlessly join the presentations together. Carrie, hello.
Hi everyone, how are you doing? So yeah, we're going to run through the anti-doping side of things. So Nikos has obviously given you an excellent overview of nutrition, so this should streamline nicely. I'm sure everybody will have their phones on them, so if you wouldn't mind just following the instructions at the top, it will just help you participate in the interactive side of this and hopefully keep it a little bit more lively. Now, I appreciate that there'll probably be a bit of a variation in the room as to how much anti-doping education you've had. The idea of this is to hopefully demystify some of it, and I imagine that you may have questions that we can either answer tonight or at a later date, but hopefully it'll give you an overview. So in terms of where we start, I think it's important that we make it relevant to us as an audience. So we know that in terms of swimming, certainly British swimming, we're very fortunate in that there's no current anti-doping rule violations, but there has been a number of high-profile issues in anti-doping that have affected the sport, which does increase its relevance to us. We do know that there's a number of current anti-doping rule violations being served from a wide range of sports for a wide range of reasons, and I think it's important then for us to say, why is that happening in some sports and maybe not in the UK in swimming, and what can we learn from them? So the first question, just to get you used to Mentimeter, is can you give me an idea of how confident you are as an athlete? For any parents on the call, you can just substitute parent in your anti-doping knowledge and responsibilities. So it looks like we've kind of got middle of the road. Okay, great. So I mean, that, to be honest, is probably where we'd expect you to be. So hopefully what we do at the end of this, if we ask this question again, is we can nudge that up a little bit. So in terms of why you think athletes are most likely to dope, can you hazard a guess as to what the most likely reason is? Now, obviously, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's probably the most common reasons. Okay, so we've got a bit of a spread. So you're absolutely right. By accident, by supplements is one of the main reasons that we'll see across all of sport, and that's because of the potential risk of contamination of supplements. We do unfortunately get cases of deliberate doping, and that probably overlaps a little bit with the coercion side of things. And medications is the other thing just to be aware of, but we'll cover that off in the presentation. So I think part of the reason for asking these questions is I think we really have to understand the drivers and where they might be unique for swimming. So in terms of our risk assessment, we would say our biggest risk would be through accidental doping, either through supplements or medications. So that's why we target that quite heavily. So in terms of what we cover, there's certain things in these sessions that we will always go over. So a little bit about governance, which is a word that sends shivers down everyone's spine, but just so you understand where the rules come from, essentially. Important practical things like how to check your medication and how we sort of risk reduce supplement use if you do at some point in your career take them. So governance, we'll just rattle through this. So you get to okay, so this is where it gets a little bit competitive. So if you look at your phone, it should give you your options. That's a bit cheeky because they all kind of look similar to each other. Okay, so the right answer is UK anti-doping. It's just a bit of a cheeky question. So UCAD is what we'll recognise it as, but that's the name of the British anti-doping organisation. We've got some early leaders. So basically, all you really need to know is that the World Anti-Doping Agency makes the rules that are international, and then UCAD are the British, what we call NADO, that then make those applied within sports, and they send them out to sports, and Scottish swimming and British swimming will follow those rules. So that's the kind of line of governance on it. So 100% me is a kind of tagline or message you probably will be aware about by now, and that encompasses a lot of the personal responsibility and pride that we, would hope that everyone involved in sport would have. And strict liability is a really key point to understand early. So hence why we educate so early on, is that it's not something that you can delegate to other people or ignore. And even at the age and stage that you're at, that you're completely responsible for anything that's in your body. So if you were to be tested and there was something found, then the responsibility would fall into you to know why it was there and how it got there. So what do you think your role is when it comes to anti-doping? So this should be a free type. So we've got a couple of answers. Sorry, I probably set that a little bit short. So I think understanding it is key, isn't it? And avoiding it. I think avoiding the kind of risks or minimizing the risks as much as possible is really important. And the other thing that we have a role on is sort of the education and sharing that information to other people. And I think the morality of it's really important, isn't it? And we'll touch on that later about what you do and then what your teammates do or what you may see happen. So I think it's interesting to think about this and reflect on sort of what you've done in the past. And this is not to make anyone feel worried or guilty. It's just thinking about how we move forward. Would you confidently be able to say that you've checked every single medication that you've taken? Have you ever taken a supplement? And have you always made sure, if you have, that that's been checked in the appropriate way? So it's just maybe one for us to move forward with in terms of some of the tools we'll give you at the end of this workshop. So moving on to medication, there's obviously lots of different types of medication you can take, and we're lucky in that by and large you guys are fit and healthy, and medication will not be something that will feature too heavily. Something that we do see a lot is asthma. So knowing what is important when it comes to asthma, hay fever, those kind of things. There are some things that have caught people out. So on the slide, Vicks inhalers have caught people out before, and some of the ingredients within Lemsip you sometimes have to be a little bit careful with. So even over-the-counter sort of things that you might use for colds and flus, we need to think about carefully. Okay, so this one is, I appreciate, a little bit best guess because we haven't done the work on the website, but I just want you to have a think about these ones that are relatively common and see whether you think they are permitted in competition. Okay, good. So paracetamol, yep, you're absolutely right. Paracetamol is not restricted in competition. Salbutamol inhalers are really commonly taken by swimmers, as I've said, they are restricted, but they're restricted according to dose. So you can have 800 micrograms or 1600 micrograms in it, 812 hours or 1624 hours. Now, that's a lot of salbutamol. So if you're taking 2 puffs before you race, you'll be fine, but it's one to just be aware about, that there are limits on salbutamol, and there's been some quite high profile athletes that have been caught out on that one. Steroids, oral steroids are prohibited in competition and for the 2 weeks prior. So that's the kind of thing, if you say did have asthma or got treated for tonsillitis and you had steroids, that we'd want to think about in terms of competition. So the key to the confusion around this is this amazing website. It's called Global DRO, and this is what we all use. So docs and support staff alike. So this is definitely one to have bookmarked onto your phone page. And this will give you basically every prescription and over-the-counter medication in the UK and tell you whether it's prohibited or not in competition. And yeah, there's, as I say, this is the resources docs we would use as well, and it gives you, I think the next slide is, yeah, so what happens when you go onto it is you select who you are, so that's really just for their information as opposed to it giving you anything different. The sport is important to get right because there's slightly different rules for different sports, and where you bought it is also really important because Global DRO, as we'll see in a minute, covers a couple of different countries, and ingredients of the same product in different countries will be different. And then you put in exactly what you're searching for. So if you've got a box in front of you, you can search it by the trade name or the generic name. You just need to match it to the ingredients. That will then, so Sudafed has been given as an example here, which is notoriously confusing. So you just need to make sure it matches exactly what's on the box. And then if I take to the next page, then you'll get a page like this, which I appreciate can look a little bit confusing, but how to kind of keep it simple is the sort of checklist we've got here. We can share these slides with you afterwards, is that you make sure you've definitely got the right medication, and that it's the type of medication that you're taking. So when it says route independent, that means you could take it by any route. So it could be oral or topical or inhaled, it doesn't matter, because there are some medications where that will matter. So most of your searches will be route independent. And then you get these coloured boxes. So green means there's no prohibition around it. Red means that it is banned, and you generally will only ever get a banned in competition. Either there will be both banned or it will be red in this box here, and green in the out of competition box. The amber or yellow box generally for us relates to inhalers, can relate to a few other things, but that's generally about how much you're taking. And you can see here, so this is Sudafed, where pseudoephedrine is the prohibited substance, but only if it exceeds a certain dose. So what I would say with these is that if you are searching these and you're unsure if it is a non-emergency thing, then don't take it until you get advice. We'll come on to therapeutic use exemption shortly. So if it is urgent or emergency, then no urgent care should be withheld. We can always sort out things with anti-doping afterwards. So that's the message around it, is if you can delay taking it till you check it out, great. If you can't, then take it and then let me know, and we'll work it out from there. The expectation from UCAD is that if you're taking any medication and you get tested, you declare anything that you've taken within the last 2 weeks, and it is good practice to make sure you always have a copy of these. So that can be either as a screenshot, you can record the reference number, which is 0.4, or you can save this as a PDF. So in terms of the countries that are involved in Global DRO, it's UK, America, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and Japan, which does mean that if you are buying or receiving medication in any other country, Global DRO does not cover it, and we don't have the same level of safety around what we're taking, which is why we always recommend taking some over-the-counter medication from the UK if you are traveling abroad and you won't have access to medical input. In terms of this, the key thing to remember is that this is not for supplementations. That's a completely other system that we look those up. So this is only for medication, either over the counter or prescribed. Okay, so next question. So if you're quick enough, you can look up global DRO and try and work out whether this very long name of medicine is permitted in competition. It is very much fastest fingers first on this one, I'm afraid. Let's see how far you can get. Okay, so I imagine a number of you probably didn't get as far as checking, but please do finish it off at the end. Just it's a really good process to go through, or maybe go to your medicine cupboard at some point where you've got some time and just run through a couple of them so you get used to doing it. So chlorpheniramine is the other name for Piriton, which is an antihistamine, and that is permitted in competition. See if we've got to change the leaderboard. I've got some new leaders. Okay. So, are there different types of asthma? Leading question. Great. Yep, absolutely. So there are a number of different types of asthma, and we see all types in swimming. So asthma diagnosis is something that can often happen in childhood, but when we get into sort of performance swimming, there's very specific criteria that need to be met, which can sometimes be a little bit problematic if you've been diagnosed in childhood. So sometimes we end up getting a kind of retrospective diagnosis. So it's just I guess a bit of a reminder for anyone who is asthmatic on the call, or any parents, that if you or your child does have asthma, just to make sure that there's been some kind of diagnostic process, so either spirometry, peak flow, something that we can actually submit if we ever needed to UCAD, because sometimes we end up doing that in retrospect. It's tight at the top. Okay, so just some other points of interest, just because they're quite common issues. So there are a number of hay fever medications that are permitted. Often hay fever and asthma and swimmers all go hand in hand. So UCAD produces some really helpful infographics on an annual basis. So this is their one on hay fever medications. And as we talked about earlier, steroids are not permitted. So either by oral form or intramuscular form, and being careful with the pseudoephedrine. So that's the stuff that's in Sudafed. So in competition, you need to be cautious with that. Okay, so TUEs is the other word for therapeutic use exemptions, which I'll come on to explain. So we've just got a sort of short scenario. So for the swimmers, or for parents, imagine this is your child. So one of your fellow swimmers gets admitted to hospital with a bad case of tonsillitis. What advice should they get about anti-doping? I don't know if anyone's quick enough to answer that. So basically, with these kind of scenarios, my advice strongly would be to keep it simple. So if you're admitted, or your child's admitted, then you need to accept the urgent or emergency treatment that is advised by the medical staff in the hospital. What we always recommend is that you get a record of everything that's given, including intravenous fluids, and then if we were to need to admit anything to UCAD, we can do that. As we'll come on to chat about, there's different levels where we need to do different things with therapeutic use exemption, so it depends on the performance level you're swimming at. So for some, they'll need to do it proactively. For some, it would only be if they got tested that we would then submit the TUE application. So TUE, as I mentioned, is called a therapeutic use exemption. So they are used when there's a genuine health condition where we need to either proactively or retroactively apply for one. So the standard ones are for people that are performing at the higher levels, where we'd have them in place in advance. The retroactive ones we do for kind of youth development level, where we know that there's a TU issue, but only if they get tested do we submit it, and that can also be applied for major games. And then the emergency ones would be where there was emergency treatment put in place. So in terms of, there's lots of different rules around TUEs, and my expectation is not in the slightest that you will remember all of these. That's really a job that we would do. I think all we need you to do is to be aware of the fact that there's sometimes some quite complex rules around it, that emergency treatment should always go ahead, and if you have questions, that's what we're here for. So which athletes do you think need a TUE? Sorry, I've skipped ahead there. Has that come up okay?
Nothing there, just says question 4 or 5.
Sorry, I think I can accidentally skip ahead there 2 seconds. Oh, there we go. That's
there we go.
So in terms of who needs a TUE, the group is very specific. So it's those that are on whereabouts, those that are on British swimming podium and podium potential, and the para swimmers on the same level of funding. So what we do find is with a significant number of our swimmers and divers, they don't need a TUE in advance. So we just need to be made aware if they are going to either proactively need one or have had urgent treatment, and then we can advise on whether any TUE needs to be in place or whether that will just be the case if testing occurs. So I appreciate this will be probably an educated guess. So yeah, it's probably a kind of strange number of days. So the right answer is 5 days. So it gives us a reasonable amount of time. So I think the key thing with this is just to make sure that you know where to go if you have any questions. And ideally, we would, like to know in advance if there's any medications that may be banned, and then we can have things in place and ready to go as soon as possible. Okay, so just as a recap, so the TUEs are generally a very good thing, and they are there to make sure that athletes can compete safely but still have the medication that they require. There are a variety of sources of information, and TUE at UCAD has the TUE team, and they're fantastic. They generally get back to you very quickly, but for the purposes of any inquiries, I'm very happy for them to come through me. So moving on to supplements. So what do you think the temptations of supplements are? Yeah, so yeah, there's a few in there that are very relevant. So I think that there's the temptation of quick gains and improved performance. I think the other thing we've got to remember is that the supplement industry is worth millions, if not billions of pounds. So there's lots of clever marketing and sometimes deliberate targeting of young athletes to try and get social media presence or social media. So I think it's just being aware of those pressures as well. So as I'm sure Nikos mentioned, so we adopt a process of assessing the need, assessing the risk, and assessing the consequence of taking any supplements. And we do adopt a food first approach when managing performance nutrition. In terms of the guarantee, so even with the batch testing process, which I'll come on to explain, there's absolutely no guarantee that a supplement is going to be free of contaminated substances. So what information should athletes have about any supplements that they do currently use? Okay, so in terms of the things that we would advise, so as I mentioned, batch testing. So batch testing is where a portion of the supplement is tested against the most common banned substances, and therefore it significantly reduces the risk of contaminated substances being in the supplement batch, but it doesn't completely eliminate them because it doesn't test for all substances. So what we would recommend for any athlete that is advised for supplements, advised to take supplements or is choosing to take them, that they have to appear on Ideally Informed Sport, which is a website that will list which supplements are batch tested. With each supplement, you should get a certificate and you should keep the batch test number, and that the best practice would be, if you are getting tested, that you're able to provide that certificate number on your testing. Okay, so in terms of key messages, the strict liability message is really critical, especially at this early stage where you're just starting to get used to some of the rules. So if you can really try and embed this within what you do and your kind of normal processes for assessing or taking any medications, it will really help you moving forward. So this may or may not be relevant. I'm not sure how many people have been tested. If you have and you feel comfortable to share, if you can pop it on, that would be great.
I'm not doing Mentimeter carry, but I suspect the answer will be 0.
Yeah, I thought so. No, that's totally fine. I mean, at this stage, that's pretty much what we'd expect. So we'll go through the testing process, because this is again something that's really important for everybody to understand. So there's very clear process around how testing should look, and by knowing this, you can then identify if it's not following the sequence. So what would normally happen is that you're notified by a member of UCAD, sort of the doping control officers, and they will approach either the athlete themselves, depending on their age, or the team manager if they're a youth athlete. Once you have been notified, you'll have to stay within the line of sight of the doping control officer at all times. So that means that you're not able to do a number of things, which we'll come on to chat about, but you have to remain, slightly sinister photo of a man following the athlete, but they will need to see you and observe you at all times. If you proceed straight to doping control, you then are asked to pick a sample collection pot. So you can see in the third picture along, there's a choice of 3. So there has to be at least 2 or more choices of sample collection pots, and they will be in sealed boxes. At no point should the doping control officer touch or handle any of the testing kit. That will have to be the athlete themselves. And the athlete should check to make sure that the boxes are sealed and not tampered with. You'll be invited to wash your hands or wear gloves, or you can do both if you choose. At that point, you'll then be invited to provide the sample. Now, the sample collection has to be directly observed by the doping control officer. So that obviously is very relevant for anyone who's not been tested, but particularly youth athletes. So anyone under 18 or anybody who has not been tested before, we would always have a chaperone with. You're entitled to have a same-sex doping control officer. And the process for chaperoning for direct visualization of urine collection is that the doping control officer will watch the athlete pass urine and the chaperone will watch the doping control officer. But just for clarity, you will be asked to be exposed, they usually say from nipples to knees, to make sure that the doping control officer can actually see the urine pass from your body. Provided you're able to supply the minimum volume, which is 90 mils, you then go back into the room and you select from, again, a choice of 2 or more boxes of your sample bottles, which are these, the red and the blue bottles below. So same process applies. You check, make sure that they're not tampered with, that you're comfortable that they are intact, and then you will be asked to divide the urine sample into these 2 bottles. The reason that there's 2 of them is one is sent for testing and the other is sent for storage. The storage sample will be used if there's any adverse analytical finding on the first sample to confirm it. The other thing to be aware of is these are stored for 10 years. So you've probably seen in the media some retrospective anti-doping rule violations, and they have been done on B samples that have been stored for a period of time. So sometimes you'll hear of anti-doping rule violations at 8-9 years after the time. So once that is done, you then will give the last tiny bit of urine to the doping control officer, and that is the only time that they touch your sample. And that is to check the suitability. So that is to make sure that the urine is concentrated enough to be adequately analysed. Provided it passes that, you then move on to the paperwork. You will be guided through this whole process by the doping control officer, who's very experienced, but that involves completing demographic information, putting down any issues that you had with doping control or the process, and recording any medications that have been taken in the last 2 weeks. There can sometimes be issues with the dilution of the urine sample if the athlete has drunk a ton of water beforehand. So obviously not being able to pass urine is a regular problem. So we always recommend that 1 bottle of water, 500 mils is consumed, but no more, to reduce the risk of having an over-dilute sample and then having to repeat the whole process. It otherwise ends up very lengthy. So generally, most testing processes are urine, but there are some blood testing. That happens usually for those at the elite end of the sport and is done to collect an athlete biological passport. So it's basically a kind of sequential series of blood results. But there is sometimes testing in a major competition setting, so it's one just to be aware about. The same process is applied in terms of notification and attendance to anti-doping, although you have to have rested for 2 hours before your sample is collected. Obviously, the phlebotomist has to handle the tubes because they're taking them, so that would be the main other key difference, and no more than 3 attempts at taking blood would be performed. So there are, as I alluded to, a number of reasons for delaying a test. So you are required to provide some kind of ID. Now, bearing in mind, most people don't carry your passport around. That's usually in the form of an accreditation, or you can have somebody else in the team verify your identity, which is realistically what happens a lot of the time. You're not permitted to shower. So you are permitted to shower, sorry. You are allowed to attend media commitments and medical treatment, but you would be observed for all of these. Seeing family and friends does vary, to be honest with you. I think a short trip to see family and friends is acceptable, but I think bearing in mind the time scale for anti-doping, spending long periods of time with family and friends when most people choose to get anti-doping done. Cool down, you can have some nutrition, although a lot of the time that will happen in the anti-doping room itself. So you are allowed to eat when you're in the waiting room, you're just not allowed to eat when you're in actually giving the sample, and you are allowed your mobile phone. And if you're notified while you are obviously competing or training, you can finish what you're doing. Okay. So in terms of why it's really important to let you know this, it's mainly to make sure that your rights and responsibilities you know about. So what you have to do and what UK anti-doping have to do. Really your only opportunity for raising an issue with the testing procedures at the time and on the form. It's very hard to retrospectively sort of claim anything. So if you have any concerns, please do write it down in the form. There's a carbon copy that is given to you. Carbon copy is kept by UCAD and one is sent to the national governing body. Okay, we're almost done, I promise. So ADRVs are anti-doping rule violations. So basically, how many ways are there to break the rules? So up until relatively recently, you were mainly right. They've gone and added another one on there. So there's actually now 11 as opposed to 10. So these are the list here. And a lot of them are relatively self-explanatory. The first number are related purely to athletes, and then the ones highlighted in blue are for athletes and all athletes support staff, including coaching staff. So I think it's an important message is that whilst we obviously educate athletes, everybody within sport has a responsibility, a very significant responsibility to maintain clean sport. So the difference between presence and use, presence is inadvertent presence, where use is deliberate use. So as you can imagine, number 2 has higher sanctions than number 1. Evading or refusing a test, so that's not permitted, and that can carry quite significant sanctions. Whereabouts failures obviously only applies to those that are on whereabouts, so not relevant for this group. Tampering or attempting to tamper with any testing procedure, possession of any known illicit medication or process with the intent to supply, and trafficking and kind of aiding and administering are all significant rule violations that can result in very, very long sanctions, sometimes permanent sanctions. Complicity is an interesting one, which is the knowledge that either individual or systemic doping is happening and you have not done anything about it. Prohibited association is associating with somebody who's been banned. So the most common scenario would be a coach and an athlete where a coach has previously been banned. What would happen in this case is UCAD will make the athlete aware and give them a period of time to disassociate with that person. So it wouldn't be an immediate anti-doping rule violation, there would be an advanced period. So the extra one is really to safeguard whistleblowing and safeguard declaration of anti-doping rule violations, and that's something that is taken very seriously by UCAD. So the last bit really relates to how you would report doping, and as you can see by the list of anti-doping rule violations, it's really important that we take that responsibility seriously, and there's a variety of confidential ways to report. UCAD will act on intelligence, and that has happened a significant number of times over the last few years where they've gathered different bits of evidence and acted thereon. So although your evidence might be small, it might be very significant in the big picture.